For cleaning lady, she protected the millionaire's mother from a slap. The revenge that followed was incredible. The humiliation that no one expected. No one in this house loves you, you useless old woman. You should have died years ago. The words echoed like a gunshot in the enormous hall of the Vidal mansion. The crystal glasses trembled slightly on the tables, covered with white tablecloth azul. The guests, businessmen, politicians, women dressed in designer dresses, froze in silence, holding their drinks halfway in the air, not knowing if they had heard correctly what they had just heard. Rosa Mendoza had heard correctly. She was kneeling behind the mahogany sideboard, picking up the pieces of crystal glass that she had dropped minutes before. Her hands, small and red from years of work, held the fragments carefully. She was wearing her blue uniform with a white apron. Her dark hair was tied back in a tight bun, and on her left cheek she had a small scar that almost no one noticed. She was 26, but she had the eyes of someone who had lived too long for her age. When she heard those words, she froze. Valentina Vidal, the daughter-in-law, the wife of Tycoon Alejandro Vidal, stood in the center of the room in a red silk dress that cost more than Rosa had earned in 6 months. She was beautiful in a sharp, dangerous way, like those plants that glow before they poison you. She was 34, with perfectly wavy brown hair and a glass of champagne in her hand that she held with a lightness that made it seem like the conversation she was having was completely normal. Across from her, almost hunched against the wall, was Mrs. Carmen Vidal, 78, her gray hair, combed with dignity, wearing a beige silk dress that at one time would have radiated elegance but now seemed barely an insufficient shield against the contempt her daughter-in-law hurled at her. Mrs. Carmen was the mother of Alejandro Vidal, the most powerful man in the real estate sector in the entire north of the country. She was a woman who had built her own name before her son had acquired his own. But there, at that moment, she was trembling. Not from fear, from humiliation. "Valentine," Mrs. Carmen murmured in a barely audible voice. "There are people watching." "Looking?" Valentina replied, raising a glass, with a crooked smile, as if the spectacle were part of the entertainment. "I'm sick of pretending to respect you. You've been trying to destroy my marriage for 3 years, meddling in my decisions, telling Alejandro what to do, how to dress, how to speak. 3 years, Carmen, and I'm done with that." "I only want the best for my son," the old woman said, her voice breaking at the end. "Your son belongs to me." Valentina took a step toward her. A slow, calculated step, the kind of step taken by someone who knows exactly what they're doing and enjoys every inch of it. "And if you don't learn to stay in your place as an old lady, I'm gonna make sure Alejandro puts you in an asylum where you can't screw anyone else over." Mrs. Carmen paled. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. No one moved. No one spoke. That's the particular cowardice of the rich, who would rather not get involved than lose an invitation to the next party. Rosa dropped the shards of glass. She didn't even think about what she was doing. Her body acted before her mind, before fear, before the self-preservation instinct that years of poverty had taught her. She stood up, crossed the room in 8 long, quick steps, and arrived just in time to see the right arm of Valentina stood up quickly. The slap never came. Rosa interposed her hand between Valentina's arm and Doña Carmen's cheek. The blow hit her on the back of her hand, and the dry sound resonated throughout the room like unexpected thunder. The pain was immediate and sharp. Rosa did not show it. The silence that followed was absolute. Valentina stood with her arm in the air, her eyes wide open in a way that mixed surprise, fury, and something that dangerously resembled embarrassment. Around her, the guests stared with open mouths. Glasses stopped, conversations dead. Someone in the back dropped a fork, and The metallic sound against the marble floor seemed like the end of something. Rosa did not look away. She was standing between Valentina and Doña Carmen, her back straight and shoulders firm, her white apron slightly stained from the glass she had broken minutes before us. She was a small woman, with dark skin and eyes as black as coal, and yet at that moment she took up the entire space in the room. No, Rosa. She was just that, a single word, but she said it with such absolute calm that it took Valentina a full 3 seconds to react. "What did you say?" the daughter-in-law whispered, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. I said no. Rosa didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. He's not going to touch her. Not today, not ever. Mrs. Carmen made a small sound behind Rosa. It could have been a sue, or it could have been her first breath in a long time without breathing properly. Valentina slowly lowered her arm. Her eyes narrowed into 2 cold, calculating lines. She looked Rosa up and down with the same expression she would use to examine something that had stuck to her shoe. "You're the cleaner," she said, as if that explained everything and at the same time explained nothing. "The woman who cleans the floors in my house?" "Yes," Rosa replied. "And as long as I'm in this house, no one is going to hit a 78-year-old lady. No matter who it is." The implicit insult hung in the air. "It doesn't matter who you are." Valentina understood, and that was what set her off. "Alejandro," she shouted, turning toward the back of the room with a speed that made her red dress sway like a flame. "Alejandro, come here right now." The tycoon appeared from the side hallway. Alejandro Vidal was 40 years old. He was tall and athletically built, with black hair with a few gray strands at the temples that on another man would have looked like unkempt, but on him seemed part of a design. He wore a black linen shirt and dark pants and had the expression of someone who had learned to handle crises before breakfast. But when he entered the room and read the situation, his wife's eyes were shining with rage, his mother trembling by the wall, and a maid standing in the middle of the room with her back straight as if she owned the place. Something in his jaw tensed in a way that Rosa still couldn't interpret. "What happened here?" he asked in a low voice. The kind of low voice that was more dangerous than shouting. This woman, Valentina, pointed an accusing finger at Rosa. This employee raised her hand at me. She hit me in front of all your guests and in my own home. The silence was immediate and total. Rosa felt the weight of 30 pairs of eyes moving toward her. She felt the change in temperature in the room. She knew with the cold clarity that comes from years of learning to read situations before they destroy you that what came next was going to hurt, but she didn't lower her gaze. "That's not what happened," Rosa said in a firm voice. "Shut up," Valentina snapped. "Alejandro." Mrs. Carmen's voice came from behind Rosa, fragile but determined. "This girl protected me. Valentina, please, go to Mom." Alejandro's interruption was soft but final. He turned to Rosa and studied her for a long moment. His black eyes held an expression that Rosa couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't cruelty, but it wasn't what she needed to see either. "What's your name?" "Rosa Mendoza." "Rosa." She repeated the name as if she were filing it away somewhere. "How long have you been working here?" 4 months. Alejandro nodded once, looked at his wife, then at his mother, then back at Rosa. And in that silent triangle between the 3 of them, a decision was made that Rosa would see repeated thousands of times in her mind in the days that followed. "I need to ask you to leave," Alejandro said. Rosa blinked. "Excuse me." "Please leave the room now." He made a slight gesture with his hand, as if he were directing traffic. "This is a family matter. We'll talk about it tomorrow." It was the politeness of the dismissal that hurt the most. Not the shouting, not the insult. The surgical courtesy with which Alejandro Vidal pushed her out of the room as if she were a piece of furniture in the wrong place. Rosa said nothing more. She gathered her pride in both hands, because that's the one thing no one can take from you if you don't let them. As she walked toward the exit of the room with her back as straight as when she had entered. Behind her, she heard Valentina whispering something to Alejandro. She heard Mrs. Carmen protesting weakly. She heard the murmurs of the guests who were already turning what had just happened into a table anecdote. She pushed open the service door. The back hallway smelled of detergent and cold food. The walls were white and bare of pictures. The spotlights were cold and shadowless. Rosa leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for a second. She touched the back of her right hand, where Valentina had accidentally hit her. It was red and swollen, but not broken, just like her. Inside, the party continued. The unfair dismissal Rosa did not sleep that night. It was not the first time that insomnia had visited her. She had known it well during the hardest years when she lived in the rooftop room in Tepito with a constant noise of the street and the hunger that sometimes was louder than everything else. But this time it was different. This time it wasn't an empty stomach that kept her awake. It was the certainty of what would come in the morning. She lived in a small room at the back of the mansion, the maid's quarters she'd been assigned when she'd been hired 4 months earlier. It had room for a single bed, a nightstand, a narrow wardrobe, and little else. The window looked out onto the supplier's parking lot, but Rosa had hung a photo of her mother on the wall and put a small plant on the windowsill, and that was enough to make the space feel like a home. That night she stared at the ceiling for hours. She thought about Doña Carmen, about how the old woman was trembling, about the sound of Valentina's arm cutting through the air. She thought about Alejandro Vidal and his dark eyes that had looked at her without showing anything, and about the polite and terrible way in which he had erased her from the room, as one erases a mistake in an important document. She thought about the faces of the guests, some scandalized, some amused, almost none willing to intervene. And she thought, although she tried not to, about the documents she kept in a manila envelope inside the sewn-in lining of her black canvas backpack. The documents she had accidentally found 3 weeks earlier when a folder had fallen off Valentina's desk while she was cleaning the private library. She had picked them up without looking. Then she had looked, and what she had seen had left her motionless for a full 10 minutes, her heart pounding in her chest as if it wanted to escape. But that was for later. Right now, the only thing Rosa Mendoza knew with absolute certainty was that dawn was going to bring something she could not avoid. She got the call at 7:15 in the morning. It was not a gentle knock at the door. It was Bernardo, the mansion's chief of staff, a 50-year-old man with a graying mustache and the perpetually uncomfortable look of someone who spends his life delivering bad news, who knocked 3 times and said simply, "Mr. Vidal is waiting for you in the study. Mr. Vidal in the study." Rosa was already dressed. She had had a black coffee and a cookie for breakfast. She had combed her hair and put on her blue uniform, although part of her knew it would probably be the last time she would wear it in that house. Alejandro Vidal's studio was a long room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a dark stone fireplace, and a window that looked out onto the backyard where the gardeners were already working silently among the rose bushes. It smelled of wood, leather, and that indefinable perfume of old money that permeates the walls of historic homes. Alejandro was standing in front of the window when Rosa entered. He was not alone. Valentina was sitting in one of the burgundy leather armchairs, her legs crossed, a cup of coffee in her hand, with the looked and slightly bored attitude of someone who already knows the ending of the movie that was about to be shown. Rosa closed the door behind her and waited. Alejandro took a moment before turning around. When he did, his expression was the same as ever. Controlled, measured, without visible cracks. He was a man who had learned since he was a child that showing what you feel is a form of weakness. And he had honed that lesson so well that sometimes Rosa wondered if she still felt anything. "Rosa," he began in a calm voice. "Sit down, please." "I prefer to stand." Valentina raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Alejandro nodded as if that were also a perfectly valid option. "I understand there was an incident last night," he said, choosing each word with the precision of someone who drafts contracts for a living. "And I want you to know that we take it seriously." "What incident?" Rosa asked. "Is it the one of Mrs. Valentina trying to hit her mother, or me having stopped it?" The silence that followed was brief but thick. Valentina calmly uncrossed and recrossed her legs. "Rosa," Alejandro resumed, and there was something in his tone that sounded like a warning disguised as patience. "My wife has explained to me what happened from her perspective, and my guests have also given me their versions. What is clear is that there was a situation that escalated inappropriately, and that you, as part of the service staff, participated in it in a way that does not correspond to your role in this house." "I participated in stopping the blow to an elderly woman." "I participated," Alejandro continued as if Rosa had not spoken, "in a way that created a scene in front of important people that embarrassed my family, and that violated the basic protocols that any employee of this staff must respect." Rosa looked at him. She really looked at him. The way you look at someone when you decide that you are no longer going to pretend that their words do not hurt you, but that you are going to let them come, and then you are going to decide what to do with that pain. "The basic protocols," she repeated, slowly. "He is telling me that the protocol was to stay on my knees picking up glass while his wife beat his mother." "I was not going to hit anyone," Valentina exploded from the armchair, and for the first time that morning her calm broke at the edges. "I made a gesture. That was it. This woman grabbed my arm in front of everyone." "Valentina." Alejandro's voice was a single word, and it worked like a wall. His wife leaned back in the armchair, clutching her coffee cup. Alejandro went to the desk, opened a drawer, and took out an envelope. He placed it on the wooden surface and gently pushed it to the edge, towards where Rosa was. "Here is the payment for the 4 months' work, plus an additional month, as Gashuni said," he said. "There is also a letter of recommendation signed by me personally. It speaks well of your work, your punctuality, your attitude in general." She doesn't mention last night. Rosa didn't look at the envelope. "She is firing me." She didn't say it as a question. She said it as someone who was reading aloud something she had known for hours. "We're asking you to terminate your employment relationship with this company," Alejandro replied, "with all the consideration you deserve, and with the best references for your next job with all the consideration you deserve." Rosa repeated the phrase quietly, almost to herself and on her lips. It sounded like what it was. An empty phrase wrapped in gift paper. "Listen, Mr. Vidal, I've been in this house for 4 months. I've cleaned every corner. I've washed your children's clothes. I've picked up the dishes after their dinners. And last night, when I saw that they were going to beat your mother in front of everyone, I did what any decent person would have done. And you're firing me for that." Alejandro held her gaze. "Yes," he said. Rosa waited for something more, an explanation, an apology, a sign, any sign, that something in this man felt that what he was doing was not right. There was nothing more. "Okay," Rosa said, finally taking the envelope from the desk, folding it and putting it in her apron pocket without opening it. "Yeah," and then she looked at Valentina, who was watching the scene with narrowed eyes, assessing, calculating, and then Shindrubain, and then back at Alejandro. The silence that followed, it felt heavier. The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before. It was heavy. Rosa turned and headed for the door. The voice of someone who saved their best move for the end. Before you go, I'd like you to leave your things ready in the utility room so that security can do a routine check and... Rosa paused, her hand on the doorknob. Routine check, she said, without turning around. It's a protocol, Valentina replied, and there was a smile in her voice, although her face didn't show it. When any employee leaves the house, to make sure everything is in order. I'm sure there's no problem with that, right? It was a threat disguised as procedure. Rosa understood it perfectly. She thought of the black backpack, the manila envelope sewn into the lining, the documents she had been carrying for 3 weeks without knowing what to do with them. Of course, Rosa said with a calmness she didn't feel. No problem. She left the studio. The hallway was cold despite the sun streaming in through the high windows. Rosa walked slowly toward the utility room, listening to the echo of her own footsteps on the marble, and with each step she made a decision that 2 hours earlier she still hadn't been sure she would make. When she got to her room, she locked the door, took her backpack out of the closet, put it on the bed, unzipped the back compartment, and felt with her fingers for the fabric lining until she found the edge sewn with thick thread that she herself had put there. She inserted her fingers and pulled carefully. The manila envelope appeared without making a sound. Rosa held it in her hands for a moment. She looked at it. She thought of Valentina sitting in that burgundy armchair with her cup of coffee and her calculating snake eyes. She thought of Alejandro saying yes, with the same calm voice with which he would have approved a construction project. She thought of Mrs. Carmen. And then Rosamond did what her entire life of poverty, of nights of study, of silent humiliations and resistance without applause had taught her to do when someone thought that had her cornered. She put the envelope in the inside pocket of her jacket. She put only her clothes, her mother's photo, and the small Alphizer plant in her backpack. She opened the door to the utility room and left the Vidal mansion through the back entrance with calm steps, without running, without crying, without looking back. Without looking back. Outside, the morning sun greeted her without questions, and the envelope in her jacket weighed exactly as much as a revenge that still has no date. Rosa's secret. There was a small restaurant 3 blocks from the Vidal mansion called La Paloma that was open at 6 in the morning. It had 4 plastic tables, a television hanging on the corner that was always on the news, and a lady named Consuelo, who made the best bought coffee in the world and who never asked anyone why her eyes were red. Rosa arrived there with her backpack and her plant and her jacket with the envelope inside, and ordered a coffee and a couple of scrambled eggs that she didn't finish, and sat down in front of the window looking out onto the street as the neighborhood woke up around her. She thought about her mother. Irene Mendoza had died 6 years ago, at age 48, of a heart condition that could have been operated on if they'd had money for the private hospital, or if Seguro Popular had processed the paperwork on time, or if any of the dozens of things that always go wrong when you're poor had failed in a different way. She had been the standard bearer her entire life, a woman with strong hands and a soft voice, who read the Bible at night and saved coins in a cookie tin for her daughter's future. He had never told him who Rosa's father was. Rosa had discovered him on her own at age 21. Among the papers her mother kept in a cardboard box under the bed, a letter, 2 photographs, and a legal document that took her 3 days to fully understand, but when she did, the weight of everything she knew changed. Her father was Ernesto Fuentes. Ernesto Fuentes, the man who had founded the real estate consortium alongside Rodrigo Vidal, who was the father of Alejandro, that today was worth 4 billion pesos. The man who had died in a helicopter crash when Rosa was 2 years old before having legally recognized the daughter he had had with a laundress from Tepito, whom he had loved in secret for 3 years. The crash had not exactly been an accident. Rosa had also discovered that, but that would come later. For now, what mattered was this. Rosa Mendoza was the illegitimate daughter of one of the founding partners of the Vidal Empire. She had grown up in extreme poverty, while the fortune that corresponded to her by blood-financed parties, like last night's. She had studied law at night, 4 years at a public university, a thesis on corporate fraud, 2 years of practice at a second-rate law firm, while cleaning offices, houses, and restaurants during the day to pay her tuition. And months ago, when she had finally managed to infiltrate the Vidal mansion as a maid, it had not been by accident. It had been a plan. Was Akam. The plan had begun with a simple question. How does a woman with no resources prove that she is an heiress of a consortium that has spent decades erasing its existence? The answer that Rosa had found after 2 years of silent investigation was equally simple. With documents that they themselves did not know existed, the helicopter crash that killed Ernesto Fuentes had destroyed almost everything, but not everything. Ernesto was a meticulous man who distrusted the partners, including Rodrigo. Alejandro Vidal, Alejandro's father, and had left copies of contracts, agreements, and acknowledgments in various places. One of those places was a notary's office in Monterrey that was still active. Another was the safe in his apartment in Mexico City, which Rosa had tracked for months until she found the building manager who remembered where the contents had gone when the Vidals had bought the property years later. And the third, the one Rosa had never expected, was the private library of the Vidal mansion. 3 weeks ago, while she was dusting the bookcases on the second floor, a folder had fallen from the top shelf. Rosa had picked it up and, as she always did, opened it to verify that the papers were in order. She was meticulous in her job. She had seen her mother's name. Irene Mendoza. Relationship with E. Fuentes. Confidentiality Agreement 1997. And underneath that paper, others. Money transfers, correspondence, and most importantly, a document signed by Ernesto Fuentes before a notary, in which he recognized his daughter Rosa as the legitimate heir to his share in the founding consortium. A document that the Vidals clearly knew existed. A document that had clearly buried. Rosa had photographed everything with her phone before anyone returned to the library. Then she had returned the folder to the shelf exactly as it was and had continued cleaning. But that was not the only thing she had found that afternoon. At the Café de Olla de Consuelo, Rosa took the maquila envelope from her jacket and opened it on the table. There were 17 pages. The first 8 were bank transfers, amounts ranging from 800,000 to 3 million pesos axte, all made from Vidala company accounts to a series of shell companies that had taken Rosa 2 weeks to track down, but which she had finally identified as Valentina's property through a network of frontmen and corporations in three different states. The next 4 pages were printed emails, paraos, Valentina instructing a trusted accountant how to record the outflows as consulting expenses, Valentina discussing with someone whose name was redacted how to make certain accounting records disappear before the internal audit at the end of the year. The last 5 pages were the most important. They were a medical report. Junior Carmen's personal physician, Dr. Salinas, who visited the mansion every 15 days, had documented on those pages an alarming progression in the levels of sedatives found in the old woman's blood tests. The levels were consistent and increasing, and on the margin of one of the pages, written in pencil as if it were a temporary note, but to which Akuzun had forgotten to erase, there was a single question. Who authorizes the additional medication? Below the answer, also in pencil, Bobo B. Valentina Vidal. Rosa folded the papers and returned them to the envelope. Outside, the street continued its rhythm, normal. A delivery truck, two ladies with shopping bags, a child on a bicycle. The world continued completely oblivious to what Rosa Mendoza was currently carrying on the plastic table of a neighborhood restaurant. She had entered that mansion with a plan to reclaim what was rightfully hers by blood, but what she had was something much more urgent. An old woman being slowly poisoned by the woman who smiled at gala dinners and signed charity checks for the newspapers. Rosa paid for her coffee, put on her jacket, and picked up her backpack and the plant. She had a decision to make, and she knew that the time she had to make it was exactly the time it would take Valentina to realize that the search of the utility room had turned up nothing. She considered her options. The first was to go directly to the authorities. But Rosa knew enough about how money works in this country to realize that a legal case filed by a former domestic worker against Alejandro Vidal's wife would take years to reach any conclusion, if it ever reached one at all, if it ever reached one. The Vidal's lawyers were the best. The second option was to go to a journalist, but without the full context, without the story of her identity, without the documents from the notary in Monterrey, without the complete plot. The story could be seen as the personal revenge of a fired employee. And that was exactly what Valentina would say. The third option was the one that Rosa had been avoiding thinking about because it was the most complicated and the one that was most emotionally taxing. She needed to talk to Mrs. Carmen, not to ask for help. The old woman was a victim, not an ally, but to confirm what the medical report suggested, to understand the true scope of what Valentina was doing, and to make sure that the woman who had looked at her with gratitude the night before, the woman she had put her hand on, was safe, while Rosa finished putting together what she had to put together. There was a problem with that option. To talk to Mrs. Carmen, Rosa would have to go back to the Vidal mansion, and that meant that Valentina would find out sooner or later. Rosa left the inn in the morning that was already completely bright and warm. She stopped on the sidewalk and took out her phone. She dialed the number of her only trusted friend, Gabriela, who had a small apartment in Tlatelolco and who had told her 1,000 times that if she ever needed a place to stay, the door was open. "Gabi, it's me. Is the room still on?" "Rosa, of course it is. What happened?" "I'll tell you when I get there." She paused. "Gabi, do you have a scanner?" "I have a printer with a scanner, yes. Why?" "Because I have documents that I need to copy and save in 3 different places before tonight." Brief silence on the other end of the line. He's so serious. Rosa looked at the Vidal mansion, which from where she was standing was barely visible above the trees, with its tiled roof and tall windows and its perfect garden that she had helped water for 4 months. "More," Rosa said, and began to walk. "Mrs. Carmen is looking for Rosa." Mrs. Carmen Vidal hadn't slept either. At 78 years old, sleep was already an irregular visitor that came when it pleased and left just the same. But that night she hadn't even slept. She had tried. She had remained seated in the armchair in her bedroom, the bedroom that Valentina had decorated in shades of gray and white, which to Carmen seemed to be the colors of a hospital, with the bedside lamp on and her hands in her lap looking at the darkness of the window. She thought of Rosa, of her black eyes that had not blinked when Valentina had glared at her, of the hand interposed between the blow and her cheek, firm and unwavering, as if she had spent her whole life practicing that kind of bravery without anyone asking her to, of the way Rosa had left the room with her back straight and her steps slow, without running, without bowing her head, as if she knew perfectly well that at that moment she was the only person in the entire room with anything resembling dignity intact. Doña Carmen knew what had happened to that girl that morning. Bernardo, the chief of staff, who had been loyal to her for 20 years since before Valentina existed in their lives, he had told her in whispers while she brought him the breakfast he hadn't ordered. She was fired, Mrs. Carmen. Mr. Alejandro signed the severance pay this morning. Carmen had closed her eyes. She had wanted to go down to the study. She had wanted to stand in front of her son and tell him everything she had been keeping quiet for months, that Valentina was not what she seemed, that something was happening in that house that she could not fully understand, but that she felt in her bones with the clarity with which old bones feel when something is wrong. That she felt tired in a way that was not the normal tiredness of years, but another kind of tiredness, one that came from within and that no amount of rest seemed to be able to resolve, but she had not gone down. Because Alejandro would look at her with that expression of his, patient, closed, slightly condescending, and tell her that she was exaggerating, that Valentina loved her, that he cared for her, that everything was fine. And Carmen knew that if she heard that one more time, something inside her would end up breaking in a way that would never be fixed. So she waited. Mrs. Carmen Vidal had learned to wait. She was one of the few things life teaches you with certainty if you live long enough. That when acting head-on doesn't work, you have to move around it. He waited until noon. At 12:15, when Alejandro was in his 12 o'clock meeting, a meeting that always lasted exactly 2 hours, and that he never missed for any reason. When Valentina had left for her weekly appointment with the stylist at the beauty salon downtown, an appointment that was also fixed and lasted exactly 3 hours, Mrs. Carmen asked Bernardo to bring her the car. Not the big car with the chaise longue, the small car, the white 2008 Subaru that she still had because it reminded her of her late husband and that Valentina had been insisting for years that he donate. Where are you going, Mrs. Carmen? Bernardo asked with the face of someone who knows that the answer will put him in a difficult position. To go for a ride? I'll go with you, right? Then he thought better of it. Yes, but you drive, and you don't tell no one. Where did we go? Bernardo looked at her for a second. Where are we going? To find Rosa Mendoza. Finding her wasn't as hard as Carmen had feared. Bernardo was a practical man who had spent decades solving problems in silence. He knew that the service personnel who worked in the area knew each other, that there were 2 or 3 regular meeting points, and that in a middle-class neighborhood like this, a girl with a backpack and a small plant didn't go unnoticed. 30 minutes of discreet questioning led them to 34 Moctezuma Street, 3rd floor, apartment. Bernardo rang. The doorbell. Parto. It was a different girl, younger, with short hair and a face that looked like she had been in the middle of something, who opened the door and looked at them with an expression of alarm that she quickly tried to turn into neutrality. Yes, I'm looking for Rosa Mendoza, Mrs. Carmen said from behind Bernardo, advancing with her wooden cane, which she barely leaned on, but which she carried because it gave her security. I'm Carmen Vidal. I need to talk to her, please. There was silence, then footsteps inside. Then the door opened fully. Rosa was standing in the small hallway of the apartment in a simple shirt and jeans, her hair loose for the first time since Carmen could remember her. Without her blue uniform, she looked younger and, at the same time, more herself, as if her work clothes had been a second skin that she had finally been able to remove. She looked at her without saying anything, her arms slightly crossed and her eyes reading the situation with that speed that Carmen had already noticed the night before. Rosa, Carmen said simply. Mrs. Carmen. Just a break. Come in. They sat down in the small living room. Rosa's friend, who briefly introduced herself as Gabriela, disappeared discreetly into the kitchen. Bernardo remained in the entrance hallway, close enough to hear if anything happened, and far enough away not to hear what he shouldn't do. Rosa poured the old woman a glass of water without being asked. Carmen accepted it with both hands. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was Carmen who broke the silence. "I want to ask you for forgiveness," she said. Rosa looked at her. "You have nothing to ask me for forgiveness." "Yes, I do." Carmen wrapped both hands around the glass as if she needed the cold to say what she was going to say. "Because last night you took a blow meant for me, and this morning you were fired for it, and I couldn't do anything. I couldn't do anything to stop it." Her voice broke on the last words, barely a tremor but visible. "I haven't been able to do anything for a long time, Rosa, and that's something that weighs on me much more than I can explain." Rosa didn't say anything immediately. Instead, she leaned forward slightly and looked at the old woman with direct, unpitying attention. Not the pity that young people sometimes feel when faced with old people, and that seems more like discomfort than compassion, but with something that was more like recognition. "How long have you been feeling this tired?" Rosa asked. Carmen blinked. "What?" "Tired." That tiredness that she said wasn't normal. "When did it start?" The old woman frowned, searching her memory. "Maybe a year ago. A little more. At first I thought it was my age. Then I thought it was the stress of everything that's happened in the house. But I hesitate. There are days when I feel so heavy that I can even get out of bed. And then there are days when I'm fine. It's irregular." "Who handles her medication?" Carmen looked at her with an expression that mixed surprise and something that could be the beginning of fear. "Dr. Salinas prescribes it for me, but Valentina is in charge of preparing the pills. He says it's easier that way. She knows what they are and when." I stopped. "I never asked." Rosa nodded slowly. "Mrs. Carmen, I need to tell you something that may be difficult to hear, and I need you to listen to me until the end before you answer." The old woman straightened her back. It was a small but eloquent gesture. The gesture of a woman who had once been formidable and who still retained the reflexes of that. "Speak." Rosa was direct. She explained to her about the medical report. Not everything, not the details that would have required explaining how she had come to have those papers, but enough that there was reason to believe that the medication she was receiving did not correspond exactly to what Dr. Salinas had prescribed, that the levels of sedatives in her blood were higher than normal, that someone in the house was modifying her treatment without her knowledge. When she finished, there was a long silence. Carmen's eyes were fixed on the glass of water. Her hands were not shaking. That was what impressed Rosa the most, that they were not shaking. "I knew it," the old woman finally said in a very low voice. "Sorry? I didn't know it like that, with names and numbers, but I knew it here." She touched her chest, right over her heart. There are things that the body knows before the mind understands them. I thought I was going crazy. I thought it was old age. I thought maybe Alejandro was right when he said I was exaggerating. She paused. I let myself be convinced that my instincts were failing me. That's what hurts the most, Rosa. Not what Valentina is doing, but that I let myself be convinced that I couldn't trust myself. Rosa didn't say anything. Sometimes the right words are the ones left unsaid. "What are you going to do with what you know?" Carmen asked after a moment. "I haven't fully decided yet," Rosa answered honestly. "But what I do know is that I need you to be safe while I decide. And in that house right now, you're not safe." Carmen looked at her for a long time. "You're asking me to leave my own home." "I'm asking you to choose your life over your pride," Rosa said. "What's the hardest thing you could ask of someone like you?" "I know, but I'm asking it anyway." Another silence. Carmen looked around at the small apartment, the simple furniture, the plant on the windowsill that Rosa had brought from the mansion, the photo of a young woman, hanging on the living room wall that Carmen hadn't seen before, but who had something in her eyes seemed vaguely familiar. Who is this? She asked, pointing to the photo. Rosa hesitated for just a second. My mother? Carmen looked at her. She looked at the photo again, and something in her expression changed in a way that Rosa couldn't quite decipher at the time, although later, much later, she would understand perfectly. What was your mother's name? Rosa said. Irene Mendoza. The silence that followed was different from all the previous ones. Doña Carmen looked at Rosa again, with a new attention, with a way of seeing that wasn't the same as it had been 5 minutes ago, as if she had put on a different lens, and the world she was looking at was recognizable but slightly different. Rosa said slowly, How old are you? 26. Carmen nodded, closing her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she had made a decision that was evident in her posture, in the way she rested her cane on the floor, in the way she lifted her chin. Call Gabriela, she said. Tell her I need a place to stay tonight. Rosa looked at her. Tonight? Tonight, Carmen confirmed. And bring a blanket. I feel cold. For the first time all day, something in Rosa's face softened. It wasn't a smile exactly. It was smaller than that. It was an acknowledgement that sometimes the most unexpected people make the bravest decisions in the quietest moments. She went to look for Gabriela, and Mrs. Carmen Vidal, sitting in a cloth armchair in an apartment in Tlatelolco that she hadn't seen until 20 minutes ago, held the glass of water in her hands and thought about Ernesto Fuentes, who had died 24 years ago, and in whose dark eyes she had seen, suddenly and with absolute clarity, the exact reflection of Rosa Mendoza's eyes. Valentina's trap. It took Valentina Vidal exactly 4 hours to realize that her mother-in-law had disappeared. She wasn't the one who noticed it first. It was the cook, Mrs. Esperanza, who at 4 in the afternoon went to bring Carmen her 4 o'clock tea chamomile with honey, the same one she had had for 20 years, and found the bedroom empty, the bed unmade, the spare cane hanging on its hook, but the main thing missing. Esperanza went to see Bernardo. Bernardo said he didn't know anything, and Bernardo was such a bad liar that Esperanza knew immediately that he did know something, but that he wasn't going to tell. Esperanza went with Valentina. Valentina listened to Tul's report with that calm that was her way of processing the things that infuriated her. Without moving a muscle on her face, without raising her voice, with her eyes fixed on a fixed point in space, which was not exactly the point where the person who was speaking to her was, but a point slightly behind, as if she were calculating something that the other person could not see. When was the last time someone saw you? She asked. At noon, ma'am. She ordered the suru. Bernardo took her. Where? I don't know, ma'am. Bernardo didn't say. Valentina got up from the sofa in her dressing room with the fluidity of a cat that decides it's time to move. Okay, Esperanza. Thank you. Esperanza left, and Valentina was left alone in the dressing room, surrounded by her dresses perfectly arranged by color and season. And for exactly 30 seconds, she did nothing but breathe. Then she took out her phone and dialed a number that she had saved, not with a name, but with 3 asterisks. I need you to find Carmen Vidal, she said when someone answered. No, we lost her at the mansion. Flirt with the former employee, the cleaner we fired this morning. Rosa Mendoza. Pause. Yes. Hurry up. She hung up. She looked at herself in the full-length mirror that took up an entire wall of the dressing room, adjusted the collar of her blouse, tucked back a strand of hair that had gotten out of place, and then did what she did best when a situation was starting to get out of hand. She took the initiative before anyone else could. At 6 p.m., when the evening news was at its peak ratings, several local news portals simultaneously published a story with the following headline: Maid accused of burglary at Vidal family mansion. Rosa was making coffee in the kitchen of Gabriella's apartment when her friend ran in with the phone in her hand and the look on her face of someone who had just seen something and couldn't believe it. Rosa, look at this. The note was short but precise in its damage. It stated that a domestic worker named Rosa Mendoza, age 26, had been fired that same morning from the residence of Alejandro Vidal after the theft of several unspecified valuable items was discovered. The family, it said, had chosen not to press criminal charges out of consideration for the maid's vulnerable situation, but had filed a formal complaint with the domestic employment agency through which Rosa had been hired. It said sources close to the family described the former maid as confrontational and impulsive, and cited the previous night incident described as Rosa's physical assault on Mrs. Valentina Vidal as evidence of a pattern of behavior. Accompanying the note were 3 photographs. The first showed Rosa entering the mansion on her first day of work, taken from a secure angle that made her appear small and anonymous. The second showed an open drawer with jewelry inside and a latex gloved hand clearly placed there for the photo, holding what appeared to be a necklace. The third was the most skillful and the most vicious. It was a picture taken in the living room the night before, from just the right angle to show the moment Rosa put her hand between Valentina and Mrs. Carmen, but cropped in such a way that it looked like the exact opposite. Rosa raising her arm toward Valentina. Rosa looked at the 3 photos for a long time. She didn't say anything. Gabriel like this. This is a lie. A complete lie. I can testify that you're not going to testify to anything, Rosa said, in a calm voice. Not yet, Rosa. They are destroying you on social media. Look at the comments. People are telling you, Gabby. Rosa put her hand on her friend's arm. Listen to me. This was predictable. It's exactly what someone who knows they are running out of time would do. She paused. Where's Mrs. Carmen? Sleeping. You gave her tea and she fell asleep. Okay, let her rest. Rosa closed the note on Gabriella's phone and handed her the device back. I need 2 things. A computer and 3 hours of uninterrupted time. What Valentina didn't know, what no one in the Vidal mansion knew, was that Rosa hadn't spent the last 2 years simply gathering documents. She had also built relationships. One of those relationships was with Mr. Moreno, a 62-year-old lawyer who had been a classmate of Rosa's father at the UNAM Law School, who had followed Irene Mendoza's story from afar with the silent sadness of someone who knew something was wrong, but never had the power to change it. And when Rosa contacted him 2 years ago, him 2 years ago, had listened to her for 4 full hours without interrupting her once. Mr. Moreno wasn't the most powerful lawyer in the country, but he was honest, which in this context was worth much more. The other relationship was with Diego Salcedo, an investigative journalist who had spent 15 years covering corporate corruption for a national magazine. Rosa had met him at a financial journalism forum, which she had attended while posing as a graduate student. Diego and a BB. They had had coffee 3 times. Diego knew that Rosa had information. Rosa knew Diego had the contacts and the platform to publish it. They had both been waiting for the right moment. That night, Rosa wrote to both of them, to Mr. Moreno, I need you to file the formal complaint we prepared first thing tomorrow morning. Attached are the scanned documents. Use Gabriella's address as the contact address. It's time for Diego Salcedo. It's time. I have everything, including something I hadn't told you before, that will change the entire angle of the story. Can you come tomorrow at 10? She sent the messages, then opened her browser and searched for the name of the notary in Monterrey. There was one last piece she needed to confirm before anything else could move. The paternity acknowledgement document that Ernesto Fuentes had signed before he died. Rosa had the photo she had taken in the mansion's library, but she needed the original version certified with a valid notary seal. Without that, everything else, the fraud documents, the medical report, the transfers, was powerful but incomplete. It was the difference between a story that destroyed Valentina and a story that would also give Rosa back what was hers. As she searched for the notary's phone, her own phone vibrated. An unknown number. Text message. "We know where you are. Return what you took, and all this will disappear. You have until noon tomorrow." Rosa read the message twice, saved it as a screenshot, forwarded it to Mr. Moreno with a note, "Evidence of intimidation. Save it." Then she blocked the number and continued working. At 11 at night, Gabriela poked her head in from the hallway. "Rosa, you've been on that computer for 4 hours. Are you going to sleep soon? Are you okay?" Rosa stopped, leaned back in her chair, and looked at the ceiling of the small studio with its damp spots and its light bulb that flickered slightly every 20 minutes. She thought about the note on the portals, about the comments she hadn't read but that Gabriela had described to her. People who didn't know her, who had never set foot in the Vidal mansion, who knew nothing about anything, giving their opinions with absolute certainty about who she was and what she had done. That was Valentina's most powerful tool, the speed with which people judge those who have nothing to defend themselves with. But Rosa had something. She had the truth, which was slow and complicated and required proof and patience and didn't generate immediate likes, but in the end, when it arrived with a weight that no lie, no matter how well crafted, could sustain. "Ipo." "I'm fine," Rosa said. "Close the door, please." Gabriela closed the door. Rosa returned to the screen, and in the bedroom in the back, Mrs. Carmen Fidal was sleeping deeply for the first time in months, without taking any other pills, with the slow, irregular breathing of someone whose body is finally starting to cleanse itself of something that had been inside it for too long. The truth comes to light. Diego Salcedo arrived at 10 o'clock. He was a thin 45-year-old man with dark-rimmed glasses and a reporter's backpack that he carried with the same calculated carelessness with which other men carry leather briefcases. He had a habit of always arriving exactly on time, not a minute early or late, which Rosa had learned to interpret as professional respect of the most serious variety. Gabriela left them alone in the living room and took Mrs. Carmen to have breakfast in the kitchen with gentle but clear instructions that the conversation in the living room was private, and that if the old woman overheard anything that raised questions, she should save them for later. Rosa placed a folder with 43 pages organized into 5 sections on the coffee table. Diego looked at it, looked at her. He looked at the folder again. "How long have you been putting this together?" he asked. 2 years and 4 months. Diego nodded slowly with the expression of a man who has spent his career receiving information of varying qualities and who knows, without anyone explaining it to him, when he has something real in his hands. "Tell me," Rosa said. It took her an hour and 20 minutes. He didn't read from the folder, but spoke from memory, with the orderly precision of someone who has repeated this story to herself so many times that she no longer needs notes to remember the order of events. Diego didn't interrupt her. He took notes in a small notebook with a pen and no tape recorder. Rosa had specifically asked him to do so, and when she finished, he sat in silence for a full minute, looking at his own notes. "The story of the transfers and the fraud," he finally said. "I can publish that with what you are giving me, with independent verification that I'll need to do, but the structure is there. That'll be out in a week. I need you to leave in 3 days," Rosa said. Diego looked at her. "Why 3 days?" Rosa explained the intimidating message from the previous night. She explained that Mr. Moreno had filed a formal complaint with the prosecutor's office that morning. He explained that Valentina already knew that something was happening, although she didn't know exactly what or from where. If we give her a week, she'll have time to move the assets, to pressure the accountant to erase what we haven't been able to copy yet, Rosa said. 3 days keeps her at the pace where she thinks she has the advantage, where she thinks she still has control of the situation. Diego tapped his pen gently against his notebook. Once, twice, the tick of someone thinking fast. The story about the medication, he said, about the gradual poisoning. Unauthorized sedation, Rosa corrected him. The precision of the term is important. Unauthorized sedation, Diego repeated. That requires the testimony of the doctor. Dr. Salinas. I have access to him? Not yet, but Mrs. Carmen is going to make the call today. She trusts him and he's been with her for months. That question written in pencil without knowing what to do with it. Diego nodded. And the other thing, he asked, about your identity, about Ernesto Fuentes. Rosa didn't answer right away. That was the most complicated part, not because it wasn't true, but because publishing it before having the certified document from Monterrey made it an assertion, without legal support, and in that state it could be dismissed as the fantasy of a resentful woman looking for money. That comes later, she said. Valentina falls first. Then comes the rest. Diego studied her for a moment. Are you confident that the Monterrey document exists? It does exist. I spoke with the notary this morning. The file is active. Mr. Moreno is going tomorrow to pick up the certified copy. What if the Vidals have already bought it? Rosa looked at him with a calmness that took Diego a second to decipher correctly. It wasn't naivete. It was the calm of someone who had already contemplated that possibility and decided that he wasn't going to stop it. Then we'll find another way, Rosa said. But first let's bring down what we can already bring down. 3 days later at 9 a.m., the magazine published the story. The headline was stark and devastating. Vidal Company. Internal fraud of more than 40 million pesos and an unauthorized sedation of family founder. The story was 5 pages long, with 4 verified sources, including the accountant, who had contacted Diego on his own 24 hours before publication, clearly seeking to get ahead of what he saw coming, and a follow-up with a medical report from Dr. Salashin, who had given a formal statement outlining his long-standing concerns and his relief that someone had finally taken action. Dr. Salinas had also confirmed something Rosa didn't yet know, that 3 months earlier she had tried to talk to Alejandro about her suspicions, and that Alejandro had told her he would consult with Valentina. That detail was the one that took Rosa the longest to process because it meant that Alejandro might not have known, or it meant that he knew and had chosen not to see. And between those 2 options, there was a difference that mattered enormously for what was to come, but which at that moment Rosa had no way of determining with certainty. The story was published at 9. By 10:30, 3 national portals had reproduced it. By 12, it was trending on social media. At 2 in the afternoon, the prosecutor's office issued a statement confirming that it had already opened an investigation based on the complaint filed by Mr. Moreno, and that it had issued a subpoena for Valentina Vidal and the accountant involved. Valentina was located at a meeting of executives at the company's corporate offices in the city center. Rosa found out because Diego sent her a text message with a single word. 2 agents from the prosecutor's office entered the boardroom where Valentina was presiding over a presentation of quarterly results. Valentina watched them enter, watched them approach, and for the first time since Rosa knew her, that perfect and calculated calm that she always wore like a second skin shattered in a visible and total way, like when a mirror breaks, not into pieces but into a network of cracks that suddenly make everything that seemed solid show that it never was. Yetish won sorba. She left the room. She stood between the two agents, staring straight ahead, saying nothing. The executives who had been listening to her presentation moments before watched her leave in silence. None of them said a word. Alejandro called at 3 p.m. Rosa saw it on the screen, a private number, but she knew. She let it ring 3 times before answering. "Rosa," he said. His voice sounded different. "Weil, Shiro war nur amor. Where is my mother? Safe. Quiet. Did you know all this?" Alejandro asked. And there was something in his tone that Rosa hadn't heard before. It wasn't the fury she was expecting. It was something more complicated and harder to handle. It was the voice of someone asking a question she already fears she knows the answer to. "I knew enough to act," Rosa replied. "When I fired you." "Yes, when you fired me." Another, longer silence. "Why didn't you tell me directly? Why didn't you come to me?" Rosa let 3 seconds pass before answering, not because she didn't have the answer ready, she had thought about it many times, but because she wanted it to come without anger, without the edge of rage that she still felt, but that, at this moment, was of no use to her. "Because you chose to believe your wife," she finally said. "When I left that studio the day she fired me, you had already made that decision, and nothing I could have said to you that day would have changed that." Pause. "Not because you are a bad man, Mr. Vidal, but because sometimes people choose not to see what is right in front of them, when seeing it means that everything they have built is starting to crumble, collapse." The silence that followed was the longest of all. "How is Mom?" Alejandro asked, his voice breaking on just the last syllable. "Just a little. Enough." Rosa looked toward the hallway where Mrs. Carmen was sitting in the armchair with a cup of tea and the television on following the news, with a calm concentration of someone who, for the first time in a long time, is not afraid of what she going to see on the screen. "She is resting," Rosa said. "She is fine, better than yesterday." "Can I talk to her?" Rosa went into the hallway, put the phone in Mrs. Carmen's hand, and the old woman looked at it, then at her, and Rosa nodded once. Carmen raised the phone to her ear. "Alejandro," she said. Rosa went into the kitchen to give them privacy and listened from a distance, without wanting to hear at all, to the muffled sound of a conversation between a son and his mother who had not really spoken to each other in a long time. She filled a glass of water and stood in front of the kitchen window looking out at the street below where life went on with her normal and completely indifferent pace. A man with a dog, 2 children on bicycles, a woman sweeping the sidewalk outside her business. The envelope with the documents was still in her jacket. The document from Monterrey would arrive tomorrow, and the story that Rosa had been carrying alone for 2 years and 4 months was about to stop being a secret and become something that no money, no lawyer, and no well-constructed lie would be able to bury again. But that was for tomorrow. Today, for the first time in a long time, Rosa allowed herself to simply stand by a window in a small kitchen with a glass of water in her hand and breathe. Alejandro was looking for Rosa Alejandro Vidal. He hadn't set foot in a rental apartment in 20 years. He didn't think of it in those terms when he climbed the stairs of the building at 34 Moctezuma Street. The elevator was broken, as in most buildings of this type, but he noticed it the way one notices things that have been absent for a long time, with a kind of strangeness that is not exactly discomfort, but rather the recognition that there is an entire life that exists parallel to one's own and that one has spent years without seeing. The hallway on the 3rd floor smelled of the stew from the kitchen in apartment A, of old tobacco from apartment C, and of that indefinable smell of walls that have absorbed decades of different lives. The Talavera tile floor had a long crack that someone had tried to fill with gray cement. A potted plant with a huge fern occupied the corner next to the hallway window, and then someone had hung an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe on the wall between doors B and a small cadora lit below. Alejandro stopped in front of door B. He knocked. It was Gabriela who opened it, with the same expression she had the first time he had seen Doña Carmen arrive. Alarm quickly turned to neutrality. He looked him up and down with the direct frankness of someone who owes nothing to anyone who is at that door. "I am Alejandro Vidal," he said, as if that were sufficient explanation for anything. "I know who you are," Gabriela replied. "Wait." He closed the door. Alejandro waited in the hallway for 2 full minutes. At any other time in his life, that would have been unacceptable. That night he simply waited, watching the Virgin's candle flicker slightly in the air in the hallway. The door opened again. Rosa was on the other side. He was wearing the same simple clothes she had been wearing for the last few days. A dark shirt, jeans, her hair pulled back, but not with the stiffness of a work bun, but with the casualness of someone who is putting it up because it is in the way. And she looked at him with that expression of hers that Alejandro had already learned to recognize, although not yet fully interpret. Attentive, without visible hostility, but without any of the layers of deference that people normally put on when they looked at him. "Mr. Vidal, Rosa said. She paused. "May I come in?" A slight pause. Not of hesitation, but of decision. The room was tidy, but small. Alejandro took one of the fabric armchairs without anyone offering it to him or waiting for it to be offered to him. Rosa sat across from him in the wooden chair that she had been using as a desk for the past few days. Between them, the coffee table held a half-drunk cup of coffee and a notebook. Mère Brazuca notes that Rosa closed slowly before resting her hands on it. Alejandro looked around the apartment. The plant on the windowsill. The photo on the wall. "How are you, Mom?" he asked first. "Better every day. The doctor who examined her yesterday confirmed that the levels of sedatives in her blood are dropping. She will need monitoring for at least 3 months, but that there is no permanent damage." Alejandro closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. When he opened them, his expression was the same as ever. Controlled, measured. But underneath there was something that Rosa had not seen before. Something that looked a lot like weight of a guilt that still doesn't know what form it takes, but that is already felt throughout my body. "I can see it." "She's sleeping." Rosa looked toward the hallway. "Tomorrow?" Alejandro nodded. The silence between them had texture. It wasn't the empty silence of two people who have nothing to say to each other, but the full silence of two people who have too much to say and don't know where to start. It was Alejandro who started. "I want to ask for your forgiveness." Rosa didn't say anything. She listened to him. "I know that those words may sound very little at this moment," he continued, speaking, slowly choosing each word with a care different from the one he used in business. The care of someone who isn't sure they're using the right words and knows it by what. And they probably aren't enough, but I need to say them anyway. What I did that day in the studio was unfair. I listened to Valentina's version without listening to yours. I treated you as if your word was worth less than hers, just because she was my wife, and you were the employee. And that was wrong. It was very wrong. And I knew it when I was doing it, and I did it anyway. The last part he said it with a particular stillness, the stillness of a confession that hurts more than silence, but that needs to be said. Rosa looked at him. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because now I can." And before I couldn't, Alejandro took a while to answer. Before he was telling me a different story about what had happened. He paused. A more comfortable story. Rosa nodded slowly, not as if she were agreeing with him exactly, but as if she recognized that this was the most honest thing someone could say about their own mistakes. "Dr. Salinas told me that you spoke to him 3 months ago," Rosa said, telling him her suspicions about her mother's medication. Alejandro didn't lower his gaze. "Yes." "And he told her that he was going to consult with Valentina?" "Yes." "Why?" The question was blunt. It was genuine. And that was what made Alejandro take longer to answer than if it had been an attack. Because he still believed. He began and stopped. He tried again. Because there comes a time when you've invested so much in a person, you've built so much around them, that the alternative of that person being what they seem to be becomes something your brain can't process without everything else falling apart as well. And so you choose not to process. You choose to consult with yourself. You choose to continue with the comfortable story. He looked at Rosa directly. "I'm not telling you this as an excuse. I'm telling you this because you asked me, and you deserve the real answer." Rosa held his gaze for a long moment. "Alejandro," she said, and it was the first time she called him by his name without Señor in front of it. And they both noticed, although neither mentioned it. "What you did or didn't do before, you're going to have to bear. I can't decide whether or not that makes you responsible for what happened to your mother. That's between you and your conscience. What I can tell you is that your mother loves you, that when she spoke to you on the phone, the first thing she did after hanging up was tell me that you were going to be okay, that she knows you." He paused. That seemed generous of him, more so than I could have been. Alejandro looked at her for a moment. "What about you?" he finally asked. "Can you be generous?" "I'm working on that." Something in Alejandro's expression changed. It wasn't a smile. It was something smaller and more real than a smile. It was an acknowledgement that the answer was honest, and that honesty in that moment was worth more than anything he had expected to hear. "There's something else I need to tell you," Alejandro said. "I know," Rosa replied. He looked at her. "Do you know what my father's name is?" Rosa said. The silence that followed was absolute. Alejandro Vidal looked at Rosa Mendoza for a moment that neither of them measured. He looked at her the way one looks at someone when suddenly all the pieces of something you didn't understand start to fall into place, and the picture that emerges is completely different from the one you expected to see, and at the same time is the only one that makes sense. "How much do you know?" he finally asked. "Everything," Rosa had said, "for 2 years. Alejandro leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that Rosa recognized as the same one her mother made when she was processing something difficult, an inherited gesture, a family gesture that was exactly what they were, in a certain complicated and unsolicited way, and completely real and completely real. "The document from Monterrey will arrive tomorrow," Rosa said. "Certified and notarized." "I know. My lawyer has already informed me." And Alejandro looked at it. "And it's legitimate," he said. "It always was. My father knew. I knew it 5 years ago when I found my father's correspondence in the safe." He paused. "For decades. I should have acted then, and I didn't, and I don't have a convenient excuse for that either." Rosa said nothing. Outside, in the hallway on the 3rd floor, the Virgin's candle continued to flicker. And in that small room of an apartment in Tlatelolco, 2 people who had arrived there by completely different paths looked at each other for the first time without the roles that had separated them, without the boss and the maid, without the rich and the poor, without the one who has the power and the one who needs it. Just 2 people with a complicated history between them, and the question of what they do now with all that. "What's next?" Alejandro asked. Rosa took a breath. "What's next?" she said. "We decide calmly, and not tonight." Alejandro nodded, stood up. He looked at the photo on the wall, looked at Rosa. "Your mother," he said. "How was she?" Rosa took a second. "Loudly," she said, quietly, very honestly. She paused. She deserved more than she got. Yes, Alejandro said quietly. She deserved more. And in those 4 words there was something Rosa hadn't expected to find there. Not acted guilt, not condescension disguised as empathy. It was the simple, unadorned acknowledgement of an injustice that had existed and that could not be undone, but that perhaps, still could be undone. Alejandro said goodbye at the door with a slight nod. Rosa closed the door, leaned against it for a moment, and then, for the first time since all this had begun, she let her eyes fill with tears. Eyes. Not sadness exactly, but that other kind of crying that comes when something you've carried alone for too long finally starts to have more people around you. She didn't cry hard. Just enough. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand, the same hand that she had put between Valentina and Doña Carmen 4 days ago, still slightly purple on his knuckles, and went to the kitchen to prepare the evening tea, the inheritance and the identity. The document arrived at 11:15 the next morning. Mr. Moreno brought it in person, something he did not do for just any case, with a navy blue leather folder and the solemn expression of someone who understands the exact weight of what he is delivering. He was a 62-year-old man with a gray mustache and large hands that moved with the deliberate slowness of someone who learned long ago that haste in law is more expensive than pause. I know Spax. The 4 of them sat in the living room. Rosa, Mr. Moreno, Mrs. Carmen, and Gabriela, who had made coffee for everyone without anyone asking, and who had stayed because Rosa had told her to stay with a look that was worth more than words. Mr. Moreno opened the folder on the coffee table. There were 3 documents in certified copies with the notary seal and the signature of the current notary, who had verified the continuity of the original record. The first was the paternity acknowledgement certificate, signed by Ernesto Fuentes on March 14, 1998, notarized before Mr. Garza Montoya of Monterrey, in which he recognized Rosa Isabel Mendoza as his legitimate daughter and declared his intention to include her in his testamentary dispositions. The second was Ernesto Fuentes' partial will, also notarized, dated 3 weeks before his death, and in which he bequeathed to his daughter Rosa the equivalent of 24.8% of his share in the founding Vidal Fuentes Consortium, a share that, at the time of signing, represented a minor fraction, but, with the subsequent growth of the consortium over 27 years, had multiplied, in a proportion that Mr. Moreno had calculated with the help of a financial expert at a value that Rosa had not yet fully understood. The third was a letter, handwritten, in the handwriting of a man who wrote quickly but clearly on hotel letterhead that had yellowed at the edges but whose words were still perfectly legible. Irene, if anything happens to me before I can do this properly, this paper will do it for me. This paper will take care of our daughter. Tell her that her father loved her, and tell her that what is due to her will come to her even if it takes time. See, St. Rosa had read that letter twice, in the photo she had taken in the mansion's library. She had read it with her heart clenched and her brain working at the same time, because that was the way she had learned to function when something affected her. To feel and think in parallel, without letting one overwhelm the other, but seeing it in the original, on real paper, with real ink, with the irregularities of a man's bowels, writing something he knew mattered, was different. Doña Carmen, sitting next to her, put her hand on Rosa's without saying anything. Rosa let her. The meeting with the lawyers of the Vidal Company was scheduled for 4 days later. It was not a small meeting. 6 lawyers from the firm attended, the financial director of the consortium, 2 external auditors who had been hired from urgency after the scandal involving Valentina and Alejandro, who arrived exactly on time with an expression that Rosa had already learned to read, controlled on the surface, worked on deep down. Rosa arrived with Mr. Moreno with the 3 certified documents and an additional folder containing the expert analysis of the current value of the inherited share. They sat in the boardroom on the 12th floor of the corporate offices, the same room from which Valentina had emerged in handcuffs 7 days earlier. Rosa noticed it, but said nothing. Mr. Moreno presented the case for 40 minutes. The company's lawyers listened, technical questions requested, additional verifications that Moreno had already anticipated and for which he already had the answer. It was the type of meeting in which the outcome is already decided before begins, but everyone present has to complete the protocol to formally arrive at it. At the end, the CFO, a 50-year-old man who looked like he had just had the longest week of his career, looked at Alejandro. Alejandro nodded once. The consortium recognizes the validity of the documents presented, said the financial director, and will proceed with the formal transfer of the corresponding share to Rosa Isabel Mendoza Fuentes in accordance with the terms of Ernesto Fuentes' will, subject to final verification by experts within a period of no more than 30 business days. Mr. Moreno nodded with calm satisfaction. Rosa looked at the surface of the boardroom table. It was a huge glass and steel table, perfectly polished, which reflected the lights from the ceiling and the faces of all those present like an perfect mirror. She saw her own reflection blurred on the surface and thought completely irrationally, but completely honestly, about the marble floor of the mansion that she had scrubbed for 4 months on her knees with a rag and a bucket. The same consortium, the same money, now with her name on the papers. The irony was so perfect that it almost hurt. The news leaked out sooner than Rosa would have liked. Diego Salcedo published the second part of his investigation. The invisible heiress, daughter of a founding partner, lived in poverty while the company hid her existence with all the documentation. Ernesto's handwritten letter and a detailed timeline that reconstructed how the Vidals had known about Rosa for at least 5 years without acting. The story exploded, not in the same way as the first story, which had been shocking but manageable, but in that other way in which stories explode when they touch on something that people recognize as their own. The old injustice, the wealth built on what was taken from someone who had no way of defending herself, the girl who cleaned the floors of the house that was rightfully hers and that no one told her about. You way out. The comments were different from those in the first story. No one was accusing her of theft anymore. Now there was something more complex and more powerful. Indignation mixed with emotion, mixed with the fascination that comes with seeing someone claim in public what belongs to them. What belongs to them. Rosa did not read the comments. She read the messages from Mr. Moreno, the messages from Diego, the messages from the accountant who had testified and who was now asking for protection, the messages from Dr. Salinas, the messages from Mrs. Carmen from the room next door where she had settled permanently and from where she sent text messages with a surprising speed for her 78 years. And Alejandro's messages, which were few, were short, and did not ask for anything or promise anything, but were simply present, in the same way that a person can be present in a room without taking up more space than is appropriate. One day he wrote to her, "Okay, Mom." Rosa replied, "Good." This morning, Alejandro went for a walk in the park. It hadn't been a walk in months. "Rosa, I know." Silence for a few hours. Then, "Alejandro, thank you." Rosa looked at that message for a moment, closed it, and went back to what she was doing. Valentina was formally indicted 12 days after her arrest. The charges included corporate fraud, embezzlement, fraudulent administration, and the charge that had been the hardest to build, but which Dr. Salas had made possible with his testimony, her unauthorized furnishing of controlled substances to a person without their consent. Her defense attorney was the best in the country. Rosa knew that. She also knew that the best attorney in the world can't make 43 million pesos in documented transfers, 16 emails with explicit instructions, the testimony of a repentant accountant, and a signed medical report to say, Bill Pierre. The initial hearing was brief. Valentina entered the courtroom with her attorney, wearing a dark dress that Rosa was unfamiliar with, and an expression that was the final, perfectly calibrated version of her usual calm, with no visible cracks, no sign of whatever she was feeling inside. She looked at Rosa only once. Rosa held her gaze. There was no hatred in that exchange. Not on Rosa's side, at least. What there was something colder and clearer, the recognition of two people who had been on opposite sides of something, and who, at this moment, were seeing which of them was right about the real weight of what was in their hands. The hearing ended. Bail was denied given the magnitude of the charges. Valentina went out the side door with her lawyer. Rosa went out the main door with Mr. Moreno. Outside, the afternoon sun beat down on the avenue with that particular intensity that light has in Mexico City when sky is completely clear. Rosa put on her sunglasses. Mr. Moreno told her something about the next procedural steps that she listened to and processed and saved for later. Then she walked alone a block, stopped at the corner, took out her phone, called Mrs. Carmen. How did it go? The old woman asked before Rosa could say anything. Good, Rosa said. Is this over? Bart. Are you okay? Rosa smiled. Just a little. I'm fine, Mrs. Carmen. He ate. I'm going to eat now. Good. There's soup. I made soup. A pause. Rosa. Yes. Ernesto would be proud of you. Carmen's voice was calm and direct, without unnecessary sentimentality, like someone telling a simple truth that needs no decoration. I knew him well, and I would be. Rosa said nothing for a moment. Thank you, she said. Finally. She hung up. She stood on the corner with the phone in her hand, watching the traffic on the avenue, and thought about her mother. About the cookie tin where she kept coins, about the strong hands that smelled of detergent, about the Bible read at night by a small lamp. Tell her she will get what is hers, even if it is late to arrive. It had taken 26 years, but it had arrived. The sweetest revenge. The first board meeting that Rosa Mendoza Fuentes attended was on a Tuesday, in October at 9 in the morning on the 12th floor of the corporate offices of the Vidal Fuentes Consortium. She put on a navy blue blazer that she had bought 3 days earlier at a store in the center. Not expensive, not cheap. Exactly what she needed for that day. And she arrived 10 minutes early, which made the receptionist look at her with a slightly disconcerted expression because in that building the executives always arrived 5 minutes late as a sign of power, and no one had arrived early in years. Rosa did not do it as a sign of power. She did it because she had always been punctual, because other people's time mattered to her, and because in that building or any other she preferred to wait than to make anyone else wait. She sat in the waiting room with her folder on her lap and waited. After 10 minutes, it was the receptionist who looked at her again, this time with a different curiosity, like someone trying to solve a puzzle without having all the pieces. Can I get you anything? Water. Water. Thank you, Rosa said. They brought her water in a glass cup with a cloth napkin. Rosa held it in both hands and thought, without wanting to think about it, about the number of times she had served glasses of water at these same kinds of meetings, in these same kinds of meetings, in these same kinds of buildings. The circle had a strange geometry. The meeting lasted 3 hours. There were 8 people around the glass table, 4 executives, who had been with the consortium for years and who looked at Rosa with a mixture of caution and assessment that she had learned to read. Two financial advisors who had the professionally neutral expression of someone who had seen many things and decided not to comment on any of them. Mr. Moreno, who attended as Rosa's legal representative, and Alejandro, who presided over the meeting from the opposite end of the table and who had greeted her upon entering with a nod and a look that lasted exactly as long as any other look, but which Rosa felt was different from the others. The main item on the agenda was the restructuring of the board of directors after the Valentina scandal. It was a long and technical agenda that included bending audits, adjustments to financial control protocols, review of contracts with suppliers that had been part of the network of shell companies, and the formal incorporation of Rosa as a member of the board, representing her inherited stake in. Rosa spoke 4 times during the meeting. The first to ask a question about the audit contracts that the financial advisor answered with visible surprise, not because the question was difficult, but because it was exactly the right question that went to the heart of the problem, without beating around the bush. The second, to point out an inconsistency in the restructuring numbers that the CFO reviewed in silence for 2 minutes before confirming that, yes, Rosa was right, that there was an error in the projection. The third, to propose a modification to the internal control protocol that Mr. Moreno immediately supported, and that 2 of the executives looked at each other with the expression of those who have just realized that the person on the other side of the table is more dangerous than they had calculated. Dangerous in the precise sense, competent. The 4th time she spoke was at the end, when the director of operations politely asked, but it was weighed down by an exam. What vision did Rosa have for the role she was going to play on the board? Rosa put her hands on the table. I came to work, he said. I didn't come to take revenge on anyone or to prove anything. I came because this company has a part that belongs to me, and because that managed part can do concrete and useful things. He paused. What interests me most right now is the area of social responsibility, specifically the employment programs for women in vulnerable situations. I know that side of things from the inside, and I think knowing it from the inside is exactly what's missing in meetings of this type. Silence. The director of operations nodded slowly. Alejandro didn't say anything, but Rosa, without looking at him directly, noticed that he had stopped writing in his notebook. 6 weeks later, Mrs. Carmen Vidal moved permanently into her own apartment in the Polanco neighborhood, spacious, bright, with a terrace where she put enough flower pots to make a small and perfect garden, which Rosa had found and which Carmen had chosen, who, for the first time in years, is making her own decisions about her own space. The doctor who treated her now was a 40-year-old woman who spoke directly and without condescension, and that every 15 days he would check on her in the office and tell her exactly what he found without sugarcoating it or complicating it more than necessary. Her blood levels were normal. She had gone back to walking in the park in the mornings. She had taken up reading again. She had called 2 friends that Valentina had been pushing away from her with subtle pretexts for years, and who, upon hearing her voice on the other end of the phone, had responded with that kind of relief that only exists when something you had thought was lost suddenly returns. Ye weep dams. Rosa visited her on Sundays. She brought sweet bread from a neighborhood bakery that Carmen had liked since the first time she tried it, and that was now part of the fixed ritual of those Sundays. Sweet bread, coffee from a pot, the terrace with the flower pots, long conversations that went from the practical to the important without anyone deciding, simply because that was how they flowed between the 2 of them. One Sunday in November, while Rosa was watering the plants and Carmen was reading in her armchair on the terrace, the old woman put down the book and, without preamble, "Rosa, how are you doing with Alejandro?" Rosa kept watering. Good. How? We're working together. We communicate. There's respect. That's a board report, Carmen said with dry affection. I asked you how you're doing with Alejandro. Rosa put down the watering can and sat down in the chair across from Carmen. It's complicated, she said. Everything worthwhile is complicated, Carmen replied. That doesn't tell me anything. Rosa looked at her. There was no pressure or expectation in Carmen's gaze, but rather the direct curiosity of an older person who's past the age when one asks questions with an agenda and now simply wants to know. I care about what you think, Rosa said finally. And that complicates things for me because for a long time he was part of the problem. For a long time, Carmen repeated. But not now? Not now. A pause. But I can't erase it either. You don't have to erase it, Carmen said. You just have to decide if what's there now weighs more than what was there before. She picked up her book. And only you know that. Rosa fell silent, looking at the pots. Flowers were beginning to open in some. The sky was November on the terrace. Was that particular blue that Mexico City has when the air is clear. An almost unreal blue. The kind that makes you stop even when you're thinking about something else. What do you think? Rosa asked. Carmen didn't lift her eyes from the book. I've known him since he was born, she said, and he has the same eyes as his father when he finally learned to look where he was afraid to look. She turned a page, and it was hard for her father, but when he did it, it was forever. Rosa didn't answer. But something inside her that had been tight for a long time loosened a little more. The first time Alejandro and Rosa had coffee alone, without an agenda, without lawyers, without the formal weight of a meeting, was on a Thursday in December, in a small coffee shop in the historic center that neither of them had chosen in particular, but rather it was simply the closest one when they were both leaving in the same direction after a meeting that had ended earlier than expected. They ordered coffee and talked about work for 10 minutes. Then they talked about other things. Alejandro asked her about the bakery he brought to his mother on Sundays. Rosa asked him what he had done for Christmas as a child before the mansion was a mansion and not just the big house where they lived. Alejandro told her a story about a Christmas tree that had fallen on the dinner table when he was 8 years old, and that his mother still remembered, with a combination of horror and laughter that Rosa recognized because she had heard Carmen tell it from the other side as the story of the tree that Alejandro had knocked over out of carelessness or and they both laughed at the same time when they realized that they were talking about the same event from both versions. It was a small moment, but small moments are what make big things, which is something Rosa knew well because she had learned to build everything she had with exactly those kinds of materials, patience, precision, and the conviction that anything worthwhile takes time. They left the cafeteria when it was already dark. On the sidewalk, Alejandro turned to her. Rosa, yes, I can call you next week. Not because of work. Rosa looked at him. She thought about everything that had happened between them, about the long and complicated history, about the mistakes that could not be fixed, and the ones that still could be. She thought about her mother, about Ernesto Fuentes, about Doña Carmen and her flowers on the terrace. She thought on the night of the party, in the blue uniform, in the hand interposed between the blow and the cheek of an old woman, in how that small, uncalculated gesture had set in motion everything that came after. He thought about what Carmen had said. You just have to decide if what is now outweighs what was before. Yes, Rosa said. You can call me. Alejandro nodded. There was something in his expression that Rosa already knew to recognize as the real version of him. Not the controlled magnate of the boardroom, but the man who writes short messages at night asking how his mother is and who arrives 10 minutes late to meetings because he still hasn't learned to be punctual even though he tries. Nobody's perfect, which was also something Rosa knew well. She was the first. They said goodbye on the sidewalk. Rosa walked toward the subway with her hands in the pockets of her jacket. The same jacket with the manila envelope, which no longer carried secret documents, but the keys to her new apartment in Roma Norte, small but completely hers. And as she walked, she thought about how exactly 2 months ago she had been in the same city with a backpack and a plant and the weight of 2 years of secrets, no job, no money, and with the certainty, alone and without witnesses, that what she had in her hands was real, even though no one knew it yet. Now the entire country knew, and more importantly, she knew it. 3 months later, in a board session that began at 9 o'clock sharp, because Rosa had asked for it to start at 9 o'clock sharp, and no one in that room arrived late anymore when Rosa asked for something. The new scholarship and employment program of the Vidal Fuentes Consortium was unanimously approved, officially called the Irene Program, aimed at women in situations of economic vulnerability that combined financial support with professional training and legal assistance. Rosa had proposed the name. No one asked why. Those who knew didn't need to ask, and those who didn't would understand in time. Rosa signed the approval certificate with her pen, a simple pen of the kind you can get at any stationery store, that she had bought the same day she had enrolled in college at night 8 years ago, and wrote her full name, that he was finally completely hers in every way. Rosa Isabel Mendoza Fuentes. Then she looked up. Across the glass table, Alejandro was watching her with that small, regal expression that wasn't exactly a smile, but that she knew how to read perfectly. Rosa folded her pen and put it in her blazer pocket and thought, without telling anyone, without anyone seeing it at the sweetest, revenge has no blood or screams or public humiliation back in the mirror. The sweetest revenge is building on the same stones with which someone tried to bury you, something so solid and so real and so luminous that there's no room left for hate or fear or anything other than the concrete and satisfying weight of what you've built with your own hands. And Rosa Mendoza Fuentes, who had started out cleaning the floors of a mansion that was hers without knowing it, knew this better than anyone now. The end.